tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
I wanted to begin by delving into the media. So last week, and we talked about this on Off the Record, William Macbeth, Harrison Faulkner, and I, City News Vancouver, you may have seen, had posted this rather distorted anniversary post on X about the announcement of unmarked graves at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. It was a post that they ended up walking back. They made some changes to the story. They stripped the reporter's byline off because they had very much distorted and torqued what had been announced and what had happened. They claimed that bodies had been discovered. No such bodies have been found. And even the band itself, the Kamloops band, has walked back its initial claim that there were bodies there by saying now that the ground penetrating radar actually discovered anomalies, which could be unmarked graves. And I don't want to rehash all of this. You can watch that episode of Off the Record if you're so inclined. My colleague Candace Malcolm has also done a lot on this. And True North published a book called Grave Error that was edited by CP champion and Tom Flanagan that has essays on this very subject. But if we bring this back to basics here, there was a profound media malfeasance that took place in 2021 around this issue. It was the media adopting a narrative without question, without inquiry, that then led to the political class and the political establishment doing the same. And if you say that truth is the first casualty of war, in this case, we didn't even need war to consequently sacrifice truth. There was an agenda that was put front and center. And by the way, I am not putting any ill will at all onto the Indigenous people in Kamloops. I am not defending residential schools. I'm saying that if we're going to have an honest and fair discussion about the legacy, about how we go from where we go from there and how we do that, we need to be grounded in facts. And there was a lot of sensationalist reporting, and then media turns around and wonders why it has such a chronic lack of trust among its consumers. Could there perhaps be a little bit of a secret there to how media can save itself that doesn't rely on government bailouts? Well, I wanted to delve into that with Peter Menzies. He's been on the show a number of times, a former vice chair of the Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission, but also the author of a fantastic Substack called The Rewrite, which had a great piece there. Shockingly irresponsible reporting on residential school cemeteries will drive the nation's news industry into oblivion. It's a very important piece for you to read. I think you should subscribe to The Rewrite anyway and heed the words of Peter Menzies, who joins me now. Peter, always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming back on the show here.
Thanks for pumping my tires, and thanks for having me on your show.
Well, they are well deserving of the pumping. This piece you had the other day, I found quite powerful. Shockingly irresponsible reporting on residential school cemeteries will drive the nation's news industry into oblivion. You and I have spoken on a number of occasions about the regulatory environment right now we see for the media, and basically increasingly news companies looking at the government and seeing subsidies as their way through. But you go right back to basics here, really, and say, well, hang on, your coverage itself is hardly the stuff of legend right now.
Yeah, there's some fundamentals of journalism that get ignored, and they got terribly ignored in the initial reporting of these events regarding the Kamloops Residential School and the incorrect release that was sent out by the band at the time that has since been corrected, but nobody wants to do it. And one of those is assumptions. It's right at the basis of good journalism is don't allow yourself to be ruled by assumptions. Don't make any assumptions. And the other one that I didn't mention too much in here, but I will be getting to eventually with the rewrite because it's about journalism principles is, check things out. Like the old Chicago City Bureau phrase that I was taught as a young aspiring journalist is like, check it out, check everything out. Like if your mother says she loves you, check it out. And none of that was done. And then the prime minister behaved incredibly irresponsibly and blew the whole thing up. And now we've got, this history based on unproven news sources.
Yeah, and I think therein lies the issue here. The original claim made by to go back to the beginning here, made by the Kamloops band was one that they did eventually soften, but it was not what the media reported it to be. I mean, the New York Times was one of the most exceedingly irresponsible when they took this and reported on mass grave, which is a very specific meaning. But Canadian media as well, they took a lot of these claims at face value. None of the rigor and inquiry that would go to a claim made by anyone else of that nature occurred there. And I must say, as someone who's observed this for a while, how much did that surprise you, or did it not?
Sadly, it didn't surprise me. I mean, there's no question that there's issues about unmarked graves. Like in my piece that you mentioned, I was there in just outside Regina when, you know, the old cemetery of the Regina Indian Industrial School was basically reclaimed and honored, and markers put on the graves of children who died there. You know, children died at residential schools. There is no proof. There are many allegations that have been thrown around, some very wild, about priests decapitating babies and all kinds of things that got reported without being checked. And those are very, very serious allegations, right? You know, people, you know, may remember certain things in certain ways and that sort of stuff. And, you know, you don't want to get in, and that's probably where the reporters fell down. They're afraid to challenge it, but you have to at least ask, do you have any proof for that? Right? No, this is just my part of my memory. Well, that's not good enough for reporting. So if you really want to get into it, if there really were priests decapitating babies, then you get into that story, get to work on it. If there weren't, then don't get into printing unfounded allegations. Like I said, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Find other people who believe that.
You have a comment in the piece I wanted to quote because I found it I actually found it quite meaningful. You said, "There is no room here for allyship other than to the truth," unquote. And why that stood out to me is because increasingly you have voices saying that the media needs to start doing all of these things that look a lot more like taking a side in a particular culture war. You know, media needs to commit itself to the principles of reconciliation, say. Media needs to commit itself to the principle of social justice. Media needs to be anti-racist. Media needs to be anti-oppressive. And a lot of these things, they sound nice on the surface, but at its core, you have a fundamental inversion here of what was supposed to be the guiding principle of journalism and was for a great many years, don't you?
Yeah, well, that's the truth part of that, truth and
Yeah.
reconciliation, right? You can't reconcile until you've understood the truth, right? That everybody has to. And like I said, there's some terribly sad stories.
No, absolutely. No
You know,
argument for
behind
me.
all this, and it's such an important issue that's what I'm sort of crying out for. Is we need grown-up journalism. We need people who will search for the truth, give us information we can trust. Don't lead people to conclusions. Don't begin with assumptions. Don't begin with allyship or for any side. Don't begin as a defender of the Catholic Church, or the Presbyterian Church or the Anglican Church or any of the others that were involved, or the government. Don't begin as a defender from the other perspectives. Be a defender of the reader. Be a defender of the reader's right to be informed fully and properly from the truth, and like do your job. And the jobs that many journalists did in this were shabby and quite disgraceful, really. And we're 3 years later, and everybody's still pretending that they didn't do the bad job that they did.
You also touch on another unrelated issue, but related in the overarching sense, in the weaponization of fact checks. And, you know, on one hand, media asserting itself as being the authority on truth, but still doing what we used to learn in, you know, first year philosophy as the appeal to authority of taking, this person that I've designated as an official source says this, therefore that's the truth. You raised one example here of a so-called fact check on Bill C-63. This is the online harms bill, the bill that reintroduces hate speech to the Canadian Human Rights Act. And this bill is has been subject to a lot of misinformation, I think, from the government. The government has tried to downplay what the bill itself says. But you note here that Canadian Press just took a Justice Department official at face value to declare someone else guilty of misinformation.
Yeah, that's really, really surprising, right? I mean, that reporter generally does some fairly good stuff, and to see CP doing a fact check on a government bill and just going to the government official to clarify is, like you said, it's this sort of deference to authority, which you see all too often in journalism. I mean, the whole point of having a robust journalistic sector is that it challenges people in authority in terms of that. So in an issue like this, where you're trying to understand a piece of legislation, the Department of Justice will, of course, have its point of view on what it says, and they need to be included. But there are other experts, like I pointed out, David Fraser, Michael Geist, Philip Palmer, who somebody should check with in terms of what the bill actually says. Because there have been instances in the past with Bill C-11, for instance, when the minister at the time was Pablo Rodriguez, was insisting that user-generated content isn't covered in the act. And you could read the act and it was like right there, right? So just fair to say that government officials don't always give you the straight goods. So it was an odd place to go to get the straight goods.
Yeah, fair enough. So to bring this back to the fundamental problem facing journalism, I agree there are market realities that have nothing to do with how good or bad an outlet is, that are forcing newspapers to change the way they do things, TV and radio. There is a profound trust deficit in the media. If the media were to deal with all of this and they were regaining the trust of their readers, their viewers, their listeners, whatever the case may be, how much of the business problem does that solve in your view? Is it 10%? Is it 50%? Is it more?
Oh, that's a tough question in terms of, if you regain trust. I'm not even sure you can regain trust once you lose it. Like, trust is one of the, piece of social capital. Like we all know, from our personal lives, if you lose somebody's trust, how do you get it back? It takes a long time. It takes a very long time. And I think it can be rebuilt. But for our news business, I think we're going to need some very good supervision. I think we need to get back to the attempt to conduct objective work, the not working from assumptions, not being an ally of any side except for the reader, in terms of that, and the truth. And once you do that, then you have to do it over and over and over again for a considerable period of time before you regain trust. You can probably get it back up to 50%. Trust in media has never been super high, for that matter, but it's because everybody has their own. Everybody reads through their own biased lens. But 50% would be sustainable for the industry.
Yeah, and I guess therein lies the problem, is that you have, I think, a fair bit of ignorance from many media companies about the fact that they need a desperate reinvention of their business model. I mean, not to say that True North is the way to go, but True North has found a way that works and we're growing. Rebel News has found a way that works and is growing. The Hub, the Western Standard. I mean, these are all relatively young organizations, but they're doing something right that doesn't involve finding some massive legislative incursion that's going to transfer money from government or force the transfer of money from companies like Facebook and Google and these big players. And again, I'm sympathetic to the reporters that, set out to, work for the town newspaper, which has a very, very precarious future. But there is no reinvention if the government is just keeping this thing strung along. And I mean, at the very least, these companies could show that they're looking in the mirror and sort of realizing what you've been saying for the last few moments. So what you said in the piece here, that, okay, maybe we at least need to look at what we're doing first.
Yes, well, I mean, in that instance, like the Canadian Press one, I I found it really kind of shocking, because it's kind of like, guys, read the room. Like people are mistrusting you because of all this government funding, right? And they're going to be looking for examples that look like you're being a government mouthpiece. So for heaven's sake, don't be a government mouthpiece. And that's exactly what that did in terms of that. It's really a challenge right now, I think, because journalism schools are graduating a lot of students that have been kind of indoctrinated in this. Well, we don't need to seek objectivity. I hear it all the time. Objectivity is impossible, right? Sort of this thing like that. So we're going to give up on it. That's a terrible approach. Right? There's all kinds of things that are very, very hard to do. Can you imagine if somebody sitting on the bench, a judge or a justice, sort of said, "I don't think it's possible to be fair-minded, so I'm just going to give up on it." Right? I mean, society would collapse if people lost faith in the judiciary. That person sitting there, that woman or man behind the bench, isn't doing their utmost to be fair. And if journalists sort of run around and say we're abandoning objectivity, I mean, you can have your commentary slant however you want. If you want to be the Toronto Star, and as they have always been, proudly, left of center, or if you want to be the National Post, which is proudly right of center, or True North, or Rebel, or Rabble, or wherever you want to be, I think people don't mind that. But when you do the news, you better get it straight, because people need to trust that they are getting all of the information they need to organize their lives properly. And when they express their knowledge of an event, that they're expressing full knowledge of an event.
Yeah, I think you're very right there. And I would actually go one step further on the objectivity thing, because you have some people that say objectivity itself, it's not that it's a great idea that's hard to do. Some people say objectivity itself is this old, passe, antiquated concept. I mean, we've seen that on Israel reporting, for example. There's a subset of activist journalists that say, oh, no, you can't be objective when genocide is occurring or something like that, not realizing that that is not a neutral, objective fact, that they believe journalists should, to go back to what you said about allyship to the truth, pick a side in things.
Yeah, you can't use the term, when I see the term activist journalist, I think you can't call yourself a journalist if you're an activist. You can be.
Which one are you?
Yeah. I mean, you can be a good writer, and you can be a good, keeping a good journal of events through your eyes in terms of media. I mean, that goes back years and years. Jack Reed did that with the Russian Revolution. You probably may have seen the movie Reds. In terms of that, I mean, he was writing for all kinds of newspapers in the States, but he wasn't objective. He was really part of the revolution in terms of that, and some stories that should have been told weren't told. But so that's not new. But I don't consider that journalism. I consider it writing, recording of events, and that sort of stuff. But I don't think you can use activist and journalist in the same term unless your activism is being a journalist.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction. Not all writers are journalists. That's true. I mean, I deliberately take a broad view of what journalism is, if only because I don't want government deciding what journalists are, because I wound up in federal court to make that case, and I won. So. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
anyway, it was a fascinating piece you wrote over at The Rewrite by Peter Menzies. Peter, always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today and for your wisdom and insights on this.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much for your interest, and thanks for having me on your show again. Much appreciated.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.